For this session, we're going to learn how to add layout tags for our HTML files to create more of a basic standard layout than what we've seen in the past. To start out, I've got my basic HTML skeleton here, just HTML, head, title, and body. And I'm going to start out by adding a new tag to the skeleton. And it's something called the doc type. And it looks like this. The doc type is it's a strange looking tag, first of all, because there's no closing tag and it starts with an exclamation point. We've only seen the exclamation point one other time, I believe, and that's with our comment tag, and it's not even a necessary tag. But in this case, we're simply telling our browser that if they don't interpret this, it can be ignored and it's okay. It's not going to break anything if our browser doesn't know what to do. That's kind of what the exclamation point does. The doc type is the W3, that's the group that creates and maintains HTML. W3 says if we add a doc type, it'll tell our browsers which version to use. Now, HTML's been around a long time, and we're currently on our 5th variation of that. So if you're wondering, like, how often does code update, how often does it change? Not very often, and when it does, it's a pretty minor thing. HTML5, the newest version, simply added some new tags. It doesn't recreate itself. It's not a whole lot you have to learn as much as it is just, hey, here's a new type of tag. And that's primarily what we're going to focus on today, are those new HTML tags that have only been around for a short while. So this doc type tells the browser, hey, interpret this as HTML4 or HTML5 or HTML whatever. And you'll notice it doesn't say anything about 5. It just says HTML. And that's because a W3 says this is probably as good as it's going to get. We probably won't need an HTML6. So at some point we'll stop referring to it as HTML5 and just drop the 5 and say this is HTML. If you don't put this in, it's not the end of the world. All your modern browsers will still work just fine. But if someone's viewing your site on an older browser or older computer, then this is kind of necessary to keep things looking correct. For example, in some older versions of Internet Explorer, if you don't have a doc type, it refuses to center things, especially like centered container divs. So this is an important thing that we'll have up here. If you're wondering what the older doc types look like, they were very long and they were very tedious to type. I rarely typed it. I didn't have it memorized. I just copied and pasted it every time because it literally took up like 2 lines. It was so long. So I welcome this HTML5 doc type. I'm cool with this. It's not case sensitive, so if you're wondering why is doc type uppercase and HTML lowercase, I'm just doing that because that's what the W3 puts in their tutorials. You can make this all lowercase, you can make this all uppercase, and it all works just the same. So the next thing I'll add, we've seen it briefly before, is the link tag. And that's going to link to an external CSS file so that we can put all of our CSS in one place as long as it's in our root folder and access all of that code. That way it keeps our code nice and clean, nice and organized. Notice I'm just putting the link tag. There's no closing link tag. REL relation equals style sheet. That just tells the browsers we're linking to a style sheet. And href equals style.css. That tells me I'm going to need to save a file called style.css into my root folder for this to work. We'll get to that momentarily. Now, in one of our previous sessions, we learned a little bit about this thing called a div tag. And we learned that we can make a div tag with a class or an ID. And basically, a div tag is a big old rectangle that we can put stuff in. And we learned that there's typically one called container. You can give it a class of container or an ID of container. Either one will work fine as long as the CSS code accompanies it is correct. And the container is a big box that we put everything in. So in theory, if you want your entire layout to be centered in the browser, then you would put your entire layout in a big centered rectangle. And that's really what this is. Now you may have seen another video from me in the past or even read on other tutorials and websites that a lot of our typical layout elements are they're going to be div tags or something like a div tag. Now, if you're typing this code out at home, don't type what I'm about to do because I'm going to erase it momentarily. But traditionally, we used to see things like this. Div class or ID equals header. And we would put our header stuff in there. Things like logos, etc. Things like that. We would also see things like a navigation bar. Now I'm going to copy and paste this because we typically see 4 or 5 typical areas in there. We used to see something like a navigation area, and we might call that nav. And then we would typically see 2 or 3 columns. Now I'm going to say COL1 for column 1 and COL2 for column 2. So this is kind of an older way that we used to see our layouts. And then after the container, a lot of times we would see another div called footer. And the footer might include other navigational elements. It might include some fine print or copyright information, but that goes under the container. That way, as the container expands and gets full of content, the footer still always goes to the bottom. It's always underneath all the other content, and all of our other content is going to go in this container somewhere. So as you can see here, we've got a lot of div tags. Div, 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 div. We've got like 6 of these here. And that's kind of difficult to look at, just as far as coding goes. It's difficult to stare at this and see all these div tags. We've got a bunch of opening div tags, a bunch of closing ones. And it's not very intuitive as to what it is. Yes, it's got a class name or an ID name, but it's not necessarily semantic. Now, the word semantic is an important word, and I'll write it in here just so we can kind of see what that is. Semantic, S-E-M-A-N-T-I-C, semantic HTML. That's a term you can Google or read about. But when they started creating HTML5, they decided that maybe they should make tags that had more meaning. And that's really what the word semantic means. It means the meaning of something or the meaning behind something. So when I see a div tag, the only thing that should stand out to me is that it's rectangular. I don't know if it's wide, I don't know if it's tall, I don't know if it's colorful. I don't know anything about that rectangle. It could be invisible. It could be aligned in the left, right, or the center. I don't have any idea what this div tag is going to look like. But if you told me something about a header or a footer, I could probably guess that the header is going to be up at the top and the footer is going to be at the bottom. I would probably also be able to guess that a header is probably going to be wide. It's going to go across the top of the screen and not be extremely tall. Now, it can be, but in most cases, a header and a footer are not very tall, and they do go across the width of our designs. So, with HTML5, they decided that maybe we should make tags that have more meaning, that make more sense. So instead of a million div tags, they said, let's get rid of all of them and call them something appropriately. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to delete all these tags inside of there. That's why I said don't write this down a moment ago, because I was going to delete it anyways. And I want to actually look at the actual tags. We do now have a header tag. Now I know header and headings that we learned in the past, the H1 through H6, and the head tag. Head, header, headings. I know it's confusing, but header is one of the new HTML5 semantic layout tags. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a header. I'm also going to add in the nav tag. Now, instead of having 2 or 3 columns below the header and the navigation, which is very, very common, I'm going to add or use a couple of more HTML5 semantic tags. Typically, I'll use one called section and one called aside. And I'm going to do them in that order. Now, by definition, both of these can just be a column. And I'm going to label section as my column 1. In most cases, section is your bigger column. It's a bigger section. It's a more important content. Your second column, if you've only got two, is your aside. And you can either call this your column 2 or something called a sidebar. A sidebar is a design element that simply means a thinner column. And I'll use the aside tag for that. If you've ever used WordPress before, WordPress is the same as the sidebar that's built into that. If you don't know what WordPress is, don't worry about it. But just know that the aside isn't nearly as important as a section. A section is where our real content should go. Aside might include things that have less importance, might include ads. It could include a second navigation or something like that. But in most cases, the aside is not content that's pertinent to our website. It's stuff that's nice to have and that it helps, but it's not required that it's there. So all I'm really going to do now is just kind of put the column 2 or sidebar in here just to know that we've got something. Now outside of the container is typically where we put a footer, so I'll bump down a little bit, and there's actually a footer tag. And you'll notice I'm not really paying any attention whatsoever now at the content. Okay, later I'll have paragraphs and images and all kinds of stuff that will go in here. I'm just putting placeholder text. And please note, everything you've learned about HTML can go inside of any of these, what I'm going to call layout tags. Header, nav, section, aside, and footer. Now here's where the semantic part comes in. If semantic means meaning of or the reasons behind, it's a little bit easier to determine what a header is, what a nav is, what a footer is, and maybe even section and aside. But not only is it easier to figure out, it also has a little bit of precedence when it comes to search engine optimization. If you're not really aware about search engine optimization or SEO, just for right now, know that it means it's how we get ranked in search engines like Google. So if you have a web design business in your city, you'll want to make sure you put that information on your website. Now, if somebody goes to your website or goes to Google and types in web design in Indianapolis, for example, then how does those rankings appear? How does Google rank that in order? And there's a lot of theory that goes around search engine optimization. It's just what that is. So some of the, most of that ranking is based on your site's content. Okay, you've got to have good content. You've got to have good words and good paragraphs and just good, accurate content. It's got to be spelled right. It's got to have good grammar. It's got to be good, accurate, detailed content. Now, content isn't all equal. So, for example, if I'm doing my site about a web design in Indianapolis, and I've got ads going on the side of the page, or I've got some other things over there on the side, I don't necessarily want to rank that as highly on my site as I would like where I'm located and what I do. So that's where semantics come in. It says, hey, whatever you put in the aside isn't quite as important as what goes in a section. And header and navigation and footer, those, especially header, that's going to be identifying things about your site like your company name and your title and maybe a tagline or slogan. Navigation isn't going to matter as much because those are going to be basic words like home or about or contact us that they're important parts of the site, but they're not going to really modify my search engine optimization. Nobody's going to go out and search for web design company in Indianapolis about us or contact us. Those are pretty basic. So things inside the nav don't really show up in SEO as much. There are more semantic tags than just these, but these are what we're going to focus on in this session, and they're really, really a great start. So really the goal here is to have these tags. I'm going to go ahead and save my file. If you have not saved it yet, go ahead and save it to a root folder. I'm just going to Control or Command S mine because I've already done that. And I'm ready to go start creating some CSS. If I look at this in a browser right now, it's not going to look like much. We can do that. If I pull that up in a browser now, it's just going to look like this. Okay, no color, no width, no height, just a pretty basic plain Jane site. So as I continue to build on this, I'm going to have to add some CSS to give these layout tags, what used to be called div tags, I'm going to need to give them a look. Now, one last thing before we do that, please note that I'm still using a div tag for a container. There's not a semantic tag for what a container should be or can be. In theory, we could probably use another section tag, but it's still pretty common to use a div class equals container for that. So I'm going to open up a new tab, and I'm actually going to go ahead and start creating some CSS. And let me blow up my text size here. And this is going to be a CSS file. So I'm going to start with .container. And I'm going to give it the same basic properties and values that we almost always give a container. I'm going to go with a width. And I'll do 1,000 pixels. That's pretty common. I will also give it a margin of auto, which will center the entire container. I'll give it an overflow of hidden, which will keep my background showing up in all browsers. And then the optional part that we don't have to do is a background color. But I like to give it a background color because it's much easier to see our giant rectangle of a container when it's actually got a color to it. So I'll go with 369, it's a standard blue, and I'll save this. I'll need to save it to my root folder, and it's important that we call it style.css. style.css, all lowercase, no spaces. And the reason it's important we call it that is because when I was creating my HTML a few moments ago, that's what I named it there. I called it style.css in that code. So I save it. I'm using Text Wrangler on an Apple, so it color codes mine. Yours may not color themselves quite that way. But if that's the case, we should be able to go back to our browser now and refresh our browser and see that we've got this blue container. Now my recording screen's a little slim here, but if I make my browser really wide, I can definitely see that it is centered in the middle of my browsing window. I guess I probably could go ahead and make my div a little bit smaller than 1,000, but I'll stick with it for now. I think we'll be okay. So notice the footer is outside the container. It doesn't get a color, and that's okay. We'll deal with that momentarily. Let's go back to our CSS. If you want to add a background to the body tag or anything like that, you can. I'm going to forego that for right now just to try to get all these layout tags in. Now, here's the good news about the HTML5 semantic tags. I can really break those down into two categories. They're either going to be rows or they're going to be columns. And the header and nav tags are going to be rows. They're going to go across my screen. And the section and aside tags are going to be columns. They're going to stack side to side. And because I can sort of categorize them as a row or a column, their properties and values are going to be very similar. So, assuming we're going to put a background color on everything, just so we can see them, that's going to go without saying. But beyond that, we're going to have really just minimal properties and values for rows or columns. Now, header and nav are going to look very similar. I'm going to make my header, let's do 963, kind of the opposite color, should be kind of a orangey brown. And for rows, really the only thing that we have to add on there is a height. So I'm just going to pull a number out of my head here. I'm going to do 150 pixels for the height. If I don't give it a width, it should go all the way across my design. And that's it for the header. The nav is going to be the same way. I'm going to give it those two properties, which is simply background color, and I'll do a gray this time. Let's see, we should do a kind of a light gray, so I'm going to go DDD. And I'll give this one a height that's not going to be quite as tall as the header. I'll go 50 pixels. And again, we can always come back and change these. Now that's enough to save. Let's save that, go back to our web browser and refresh that, and we should start seeing this come into place. Now I'm going to zoom out a little bit here from my browsing window, and you can see that my design is centered. My header is kind of this brownish orange, and it's 150 pixels. My navigation's gray, and it takes up a little less height. We need to get our two columns lined up side by side, and we'll have a pretty good start to a layout here. So back to my code. I'm going to hit enter a few times and go on down so you can see more code. The next two I need to do are my section and aside tags. Now notice on these CSS rules there's no prefix. There's no dot, there's no pound, there's nothing before it, and that's because it correlates with an existing HTML tag. A dot, like we had up here, is a class. When we said class equals container, that needs to be a class, which is a dot. ID would start with a pound sign instead, or a hashtag. But tags like header, nav, section, aside, and footer, no prefix. There's an existing tag that goes with that. Now, just like header and nav were very similar in their properties and values, section and aside will be as well. They will need a width, and I'll make this 700 pixels wide, and they need something called a float. Now, float, in a very generic form, means to align. And we only get two choices for float. We get left or right. And if you've got more than two columns or two things you're stacking side by side, a general rule of thumb is that everything should get a float left. Everything should get a float left. And float doesn't exactly mean align. It's a good way to think about it at first as you're learning it, but really, float left means float to the left of the next object. Float to the left of the next object. So if I add in another column, like my aside that I'm going to add here in a few minutes, if I didn't put any float on the aside, it would still technically work because section is going to float to the left of the aside. It's pretty good practice to put a float on everything that stacks side by side. Every column is going to have a float. And if you can't remember when to use which, here's a nice little industry secret. Put a float left on everything. Put a float left on everything and they'll stack side to side. In theory, you should use float right on the rightmost object, but float left really works fine. So on my section, I'll do float left. On my aside, I'll do a width of 300. Now I'm being strategic about these widths because notice 700 and 300 add up to 1,000. 1,000 is my container. It doesn't matter how many columns you've got. If you've got two, they have to add up to whatever your container is. If you've got 3 columns or 4 columns, they have to add up to what your container is. If I did 700 and 400, which would be too wide to fit in the container, they're not going to stack side by side. So there is a little bit of math here. And in real life, I'd love to say, like, yeah, they're always going to be easy numbers to add up in your head, like 700 and 300, but they rarely are. They really depend on the amount of content and graphics that you've got to put in. So we'll go with 700 and 300 to keep it nice and simple today. Float on this one, I'll do right. Since I've only got a left column and a right column, it makes it kind of easy. It's also always good to put a background color. Width and float are the only two we have to have, but let's go ahead and do that. I'll put a background color on each one of these, and again, I'll do some grayscale. I'll do 999, and down here, these may turn out to be ugly colors. And then down here, I'll do BBB. We did D up there above, so they'll all be different shades of gray. Be enough to see. I'll save that. I'll go back to my browser and refresh it. And it does work, but it may not be what you expected. My header has a height, my navigation has a height, but my columns do not. They are stacking side by side. And if these get taller and go down the page, and I think this is going to look just fine, but for right now they look kind of silly. And you might be thinking, well, I know how to fix that. I'll just add a height. And that's really not a good idea. And I'm going to show you why here. If I add a height, and I'll add a really short height. I'll add like 100 pixels. If I add a height, does it work? oops. Yes, it did add a height of 100 pixels. But once I start adding in content, bad things are going to happen if I've only got a height of 100. See, when you add a height, it really intends to stay that height no matter what. So if I've got 3 paragraphs to squeeze in here, they're not going to fit. So what's going to happen is my browser is going to be open to interpret what to do. Most browsers will go ahead and make the column taller to show our 3 paragraphs, but the gray background would cut off, and that would just be really ugly. So one of the nice sort of plan Bs is something called a min height. Now this is optional. You don't have to have this. A min height stands for minimum height, and that says I want you to be at least this tall. I'm going to put a nice big number in there like 500, and I'm going to actually put that on both of my section and my side. It's not necessary, but what it'll do for me, if I save it and refresh that, is it'll make my layout look better. Now these columns are 500 pixels tall. I've still got a footer down there at the bottom that I can scroll down to. But essentially, it just makes my layout look more like a standard layout. I've got a header where I can put my logo and my title in. I've got a navigation bar where I can put buttons and anchor tags. And I've got 2 columns where I can put whatever I want. So the min height just says, you know what, this should at least be this tall. Just for the design's sake, for visual purposes. If it needs to get taller than 500, if I've got 15 paragraphs I need to fit in here, it'll expand accordingly. If I only have 1 sentence in here, it'll at least be 500 tall, and I'm okay with that. So min height is not required. It is it's common, but it's an option that you might want to put in, especially here at the beginning while we're learning this code. So to wrap up this part here, the good news is we've got some patterns in this code that are fairly easy to memorize. Now I know that you're probably looking at 26 lines of code and you're thinking, you know, this doesn't seem simple, Alan. I can't memorize this. And maybe, but in any case, here's what I can tell you. I've got these 4 properties memorized for my container. A container is always going to have a width, a margin, an overflow, and 99% of the time a background. A header and a nav. They're both rows. They both go across my screen. The only property I have to have for a header, for a row like a header and nav, is height. So that's pretty easy to memorize. Rows get height. Rows get height. I can do that. Columns, like my section and an aside, a column is going top to bottom. They stack side by side. Columns get width and float. They must have a width and they must have a float in order to stack side by side. Otherwise, you don't have to have background color and min height. Background color helps us to see it. Min height helps us to visually see how tall they can be when they get content. So section and aside, those are columns. They need a width and a float. So if I sum it up quickly, a container has 4 properties. Rows have 1, and columns have 2. If you can memorize that, you can get really, really far in web design, because just about every piece of layout you'll ever do will consist of a container, a row, or a column. One last CSS rule to put in here, and we'll be done with this lesson. That is footer. And if I go out to my browser and glance, my footer's just hanging out down here. The footer is going to have a lot of the same properties as the container. I need it to be the same width as the container. I need it to center like container. And I really don't care about the color, if it's the same or not. But width should match the container, as should the margin of auto. Now, if you know your footer is going to have a certain height, you can add that, or min height in this case. I'll give it a min height of 100 pixels. And if you want to give it a background color, you're always welcome to do so and encouraged to do so. I'm running out of shades of gray here. I'm going to do 555. Save it. Go out to my browser. Give it a big refresh, and there's my footer. So now I've got what a lot of designers call the holy grail of website layout, a centered container. You can see it's centered if you zoom in and out. I've got a centered container, a header, a nav bar, a couple of columns of content, and a footer. So there you go. You can do a whole lot with this, and now you're welcome to start plugging in whatever content you want. Images, anchor tags, headings, paragraphs, line breaks. Even within these things like section, if you've got want to split that up into 2 columns or 2 or 3 things that stack side by side, drop in some div tags. Beyond this, you can put whatever you want in it. And the last piece of good news, if I swing back over to my HTML, what I can tell you about the HTML is that this really truly is kind of like a standard skeleton now. I know that that's a lot to memorize, but just about every website I do professionally will start this way. Do we always have to have a section and a side? No, sometimes we'll just have one, or sometimes they'll be reversed, but these are the elements that'll be in place. Beyond this, we can design whatever we want on the rest of this. So this is a great skeleton, a good thing to practice and memorize. So, and one just last note, as I'm maybe a lot of you caught this as you were doing it, I forgot to put a closing slash on my head tag. I'm glad I caught this here at the end. It didn't hurt anything. It still looked okay in my browser, but that's a quirky little mistake that some browsers may not pick up on. So if you're going back to the HTML, make sure you add that slash in there on the 6th line down. So sorry about that. There you go. Hopefully that makes sense. If you need anything, shoot me an email or leave a comment below, and enjoy. Thanks a lot.